New York's classic rock, Q1043.
Good morning, Harvey Araton. He's a longtime New York City sports journalist, worked 25 years at the New York Times, still contributes there. He's the author or co-author of not one, not two, but 7 books. And his most recent book is called Our Last Season, but it's not about an athlete. It's not about a superstar. It's not about a household name. It's about a friend and a fan of the Knicks. Tell us the background of this book. First of all, welcome, Harvey.
Thank you, Shelley. It's great to be here. Well, this is, it's a different kind of sports book, if you could even describe it as a sports book at all. I think the sports element of it is that the mutual love that I shared with a dear friend named Michelle Musler was basketball at Madison Square Garden. Michelle was a longtime Knicks fan who sat in the first row behind the bench, the Knicks bench, for 45 years. And I met her very early on in my sports writing career when I was a young beat reporter for the New York Post. And a friendly woman who always had something interesting to talk about when we came out for games at courtside. And so I have to say that the friendship began largely for me out of self-interest. I mean, I'm a young kid covering the Knicks for a scoop-minded newspaper like the Post, and here's a woman sitting right behind the bench looking into all the team huddles, and I'm thinking, now there's someone I want to get to know. But the friendship took off from there, and over the 40 years that I knew Michelle, she became something of a surrogate parent, life coach, and someone who had a tremendous impact on my life.
Tell us about that impact.
Well, Michelle's career, Michelle's life, I used to always kind of tease her in the early years of our friendship when I began to find out what her backstory was. I used to always say to her, your life story is a book. And she would just kind of wave at me like, yeah, right. But this is a woman who was married at a young age, had 5 kids in less than a decade. And when they were all pretty young, she settled into suburban life in Stamford, Connecticut. And when the kids were pretty young, her husband had an affair with a woman in the neighborhood and ultimately took off and left her really without a reliable source of income, 5 kids to raise on her own. And really, although she was a college graduate, no real career to keep a roof over her kids' head. And almost from scratch, she launched a career in human resources and ultimately wound up with her own company as a corporate executive trainer that took her all over the world. Companies like Procter & Gamble would hire her and send her out to Jakarta in the Philippines and Hong Kong to work with their executives who were struggling. And so she had tremendous insight into the human condition and behavior and just working with people. And I reaped the benefits of that expertise because she became someone who counseled me, not just on professional things like, job changes and career crises, but also, all the milestone things that we face in life, like, relationships and, getting married and dealing with health issues and parental family issues. She became a de facto therapist for me and someone, I always said that she was the greatest listener. I wasn't the only person she befriended at the Garden. She was well known. I always consider her sort of like the flip side of Spike Lee, whereas he's the face of Knicks fans, the celebrity face of Knicks. Michelle was, and Spike sits on Celebrity Row within full view of the people are watching TV at home or elsewhere in the Garden, Michelle was cast in a different role. She was well known at courtside, but she sat literally behind her team. She was like the ultimate fan behind her guys, but all the players from the days of Walt Frazier to the days of Charles Oakley and Patrick Ewing, Pat Riley, Jeff Van, they all knew Michelle. They all had professional or casual relationships with her, or close friendships. She was close with a lot of the wives of the players or the girlfriends, in some cases, the wives and the girlfriends. She just, she was just one of these characters at courtside. And I think what's interesting is that the book has come out at a time when there are no characters at courtside anymore, at least for the time being. And I think the teams, I was talking to Mike Breen, the great Knicks broadcaster for the Knicks and ABC for the league recently, and he was telling me that when the league resumed last summer in Orlando in its so-called bubble, that the greatest impression that was made on him with the resumption of games was that there were no people like Michelle at the games anymore. The people at courtside, I think basketball courtside is the most intimate venue in sports, right? Also probably the most expensive. But because the fans are so close to the players, they could literally reach out and touch them.
And sweat on them.
Yes. Yes. Why they're not there right now, and may not be for quite a while. But, they provide the character to the sport. And it wasn't just Michelle over the years, my 40 years roughly of being around the Garden. I knew many people, interesting people who interacted with the players. But Michelle was a special one for me, and it was a privilege to be able to write this book about the friendship and her.
I am speaking this morning with Harvey Araton. He's a longtime New York City sports journalist, 25 years at the New York Times. And his book, Our Last Season, A Writer, a Fan of Friendship, is not about an athlete. It's about somebody who was with him for decades, just a fan at MSG. Tell us something surprising, something we would find surprising about Spike Lee.
About Spike Lee? Well,
I just watched his movie yesterday, Da 5 Bloods. I just finished it yesterday. So that's coincidence.
Well, I knew Spike before he was Spike, right?
Uh-huh.
He was a Knicks fan from the time he was a little boy growing up in Brooklyn in Fort Greene. And when he was a film student at NYU, and in the immediate aftermath, as he began to launch his career, he was always at the Garden, and he always wanted to come down and talk to us, because in those days he was probably sitting up in the cheap seats, and he would always come down around the court to chat up the writers. Now, in those days, I was working for the New York Post and the Daily News, and he was always like, the ushers were always keeping an eye out for him to chase him away. So he was like, always like trying to stay 2 steps ahead of the posse there. And he used to say to us all the time, I'm a filmmaker. And I remember in the years, I can't remember exactly what year it was, but he was bragging on this film that was going to come out called She's Gotta Have It. And one day I was with I guess it was my wife, or at that time she might have been my fiance. And we were walking down Broadway, and we come upon one of the theaters, and I see a long line of people, and it says Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It. And I say to my wife, that's the guy from the Garden. He's been telling me about this film for months. And we got on the line and we went in to see it, and it was a riot, right? That's where the Mars Blackman character originates. And so that's really the beginning of Spike Lee. And all of us who were covering the Knicks knew him long before anybody in the general public did.
Funny, that's interesting. You are in a tough business. Newspapers are dying. What has it been like for you? Because it's not something that we really anticipated. I mean, things are just changing so rapidly in our culture, but what's happening with newspapers and magazines has been this steady decline. It's frightening to me, because it's frightening in that people are going to be lacking getting local news. But for you, it's your career.
Well, I'm probably one of the more fortunate ones, Shelley, because I reached a point in my career where I was able to leave the Times staff, full-time staff, a couple of years ago. I just was tired of the travel after all the years on the road. And I was in a position where I was able to downsize it and, do my own projects. And I also teach at Montclair State University. But, the sad irony is that the capacity for great storytelling is greater than ever with with the technology that we have today that we didn't have. Certainly when I started, I tell some of my friends, when I started, I was carrying around a portable Olivetti typewriter, and they look at me like, how old are you, 140? But the sad irony is that when the storytelling, because of the technology, is so much better, the formula for making it work online isn't really yet developed. I mean, the New York Times has done tremendously with its, pay subscription service. They're now selling more subscriptions around the world than they ever did back in the good old days. But for local news, people have not yet developed the habit of paying for local news, things that they've been getting online for free for all these years. I think the industry made a grave mistake back in the 90s when they went online. They thought, oh, isn't this cool? We get to, sell a few ads and, get a few more readers, but they didn't have the vision to see that, what was going to happen with Craigslist and Google, and all the advertising was going to disappear. So now they're struggling to kind of turn that around. And, I think it's still up in the air as to the long-term survival for local news. And I don't know how we replace that in terms of keeping politicians honest and understanding what's going on in our school districts. All of that really needs to be figured out, and probably in a hurry.
We only have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask you if you were surprised that it was the WNBA that took the lead in sports with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Not at all, because I think I've covered women's sports for a long time. I became fascinated by, the Women's World Cup in the late 90s and the formation of the WNBA. And I went to like 20 straight women's Final Fours in the college game. And I see that women approach sports in a very different way than men do. They're looking more for the humanistic experience from it. I mean, they're ferocious competitors, don't get me wrong, but they put more of themselves into it. I think there's a sense, I don't know, maybe it's, because they understand that it's been more of a struggle for women to get access to the playing field, so that they're more mindful of social justice, things of that nature. The WNBA has been out front on these issues for a lot longer than, just since last spring. And we've seen some incredible examples. Maya Moore, basically taking leave of her career in her prime to pursue justice for a man whose story she became familiar with, and ultimately she wound up marrying him, and he was freed from jail with a lot of the help coming from Maya and her team. So I'm not surprised at all. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've been so attracted to the women's sports movement in the first place.
Very interesting. We have run out of time. Harvey Araton's book, Our Last Season, A Writer, a Fan, a Friendship, it is out. He's a New York Times bestselling author, longtime Knicks reporter and just an overall sports reporter. And if you missed any part of this conversation, you can download the iHeartRadio app. It is free, and my podcast lives on as Sonstein Sessions. And so thank you so much, Harvey.
New York's classic rock, Q1043.